Several cities across the U.S. are holding National Day of Action rallies this weekend in a show of solidarity with the Asian American community. Calls to end violence and discrimination have grown recently in response to a significant spike in attacks against those of Asian descent. According to the organization Stop AAPI Hate, nearly 3,800 hate incidents were reported between March 2020 and February 2021. Now activists and lawmakers are pushing for stronger anti-hate crime laws to address the issue. For more on all of this, I'm joined now by Maya King. She's a national politics reporter for Politico. Maya, anti-Asian racism is getting more attention right now, but it's certainly not new in the United States. What is it about this moment that's getting more people involved in the fight?
Well, Lana, as you pointed out, over the last year, there's been a really high spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. The climax of that, or really one of the most violent instances, of course, was what we saw on March 16th in Atlanta. Law enforcement have not yet classified the shooting as a hate crime. However, a number of community advocates, Asian American leaders, not just in the Georgia State House, but also on the national level, have really upped the ante in their calls to classify this shooting, this crime, indeed as a hate crime, saying that a lot of the rhetoric coming from the Trump White House that blamed a number of Asian Americans wrongly for the coronavirus and its spread in the United States has contributed to these feelings of malintent toward Asian American communities over the last year and a half. And so really what we're seeing now are calls among leaders and other community advocates to not only classify this as a hate crime, but rectify the hurt that it's caused to Asian American communities.
Well, former President Trump used a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. How do activists want political leaders to address and reverse the type of damage that he and others have done?
Well, a number of the advocates that I spoke to pointed to President Biden's executive orders on hate crimes against Asian Americans that not only condemn these crimes as, quote, anti-American or un-American, but also direct a number of federal agencies to rectify these wrongs within the work that they do by increasing diversity in their ranks, by educating those who work for them of the dangers of this kind of language and blaming the coronavirus or calling it quote, the China virus or Wuhan virus, which are very damaging and, of course, incorrect terms to refer to the coronavirus as, that to only further stoke tensions. So really what they're calling for to rectify a lot of this from the past administration is a continuation of these kinds of policies that will call out a number of these wrongs and aim to rectify them, not just on a national level with words of encouragement from the president, which are certainly helpful, but also on the federal level within a number of these agencies. And of course, as Biden pointed out last week, passing the No Hate Act in Congress, which would get folks a little bit closer to an understanding and also tracking of these hate crimes to try to curb their spread so quickly in the United States.
Well, speaking of the No Hate Act, and Democratic lawmakers are planning to introduce that bill, I want you to tell us a little bit more about that legislation and how it would deal with the increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, but also this shouldn't be a political Republican versus Democrat sort of issue. Are Republicans signaling that they are on board as well?
Well, I think that we can look at the state of Georgia as one sign of Republicans starting to warm up to this idea of condemning and addressing hate crimes. Last summer, in the wake of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, Georgia was one of the last 4 states to pass a hate crimes law that actually would add to one's sentence or to their sentencing or their punishment if they commit a crime and it can be proven that it was a hate crime. So that's one step forward. There are a number of Asian American women who are Republicans in Congress now who have not yet weighed in widely on this issue of hate crimes legislation, but there hasn't been any direct rebuff of this legislation on the national level, which is one sign to lawmakers and to advocates that this is something that could move quickly. This hate crimes legislation now, as it stands in Congress, though it is a proposal but will be introduced soon, does 2 things that really would stand to change the direction of hate crimes legislation in this country. And the first is giving the Department of Justice a more active role in addressing these hate crimes and starting to prosecute them, which is something that people have been calling for, is a more active role of law enforcement on the national and state level as it relates to these hate crimes, to not only track them, but to really punish them and make an example of those who really have started to increase their shows of hate against Asian American communities. And the second thing that it does, which is what a number of Asian American leaders in Georgia really stressed in their meeting with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris 2 weeks ago, was it tracks these hate crimes and actually establishes a database to show when they're happening, how often they're happening, where they're happening, and what the ramifications were behind these hate crimes. And a number of Asian American leaders I spoke to said that the data is extremely important in tracking and also in prosecuting these hate crimes, because historically, these are instances that have gone unreported or underreported in the past.
Well, speaking of data, Maya, you've written about how more Asian Americans are mobilizing politically, specifically in Georgia. The AAPI voter turnout in that state increased by a jaw-dropping 91% between 2016 and 2020. Exit polls show majority of the AAPI votes cast in November were for President Biden. How are political leaders trying to capture this demographic for future elections?
Well, one thing that I heard a lot on the ground in Atlanta last week and last weekend was this idea that Asian American communities have really started to realize their political power. You pointed out that 91% jump in turnout, and the majority of that going towards Democrats. That was a huge win for Asian American community leaders and Asian American political leaders, too, who had really tried over the last few years to get their communities out to vote and to give them that same level of political power that you've seen now across the board with other communities of color. And so now what their efforts are is to channel a lot of the anger and the frustration that has brought even more Asian Americans out to the streets in protest and saying that they won't stand for more hate crimes, and saying, look, what you also can do is continue to elect members of your community, continue to diversify, add more Asian Americans to this conversation as it relates to political representation, and be able to turn them out, specifically in Georgia in 2022, where we know that there is a gubernatorial election and another Senate election. And they're hoping that a lot of this energy that you're seeing in the streets and that you're seeing in terms of activism and this sudden building momentum over the last few years, in this realization that Asian Americans truly do have a lot of power to shift electoral outcomes, they're hoping that that will continue into these next few years as a number of battleground Senate and gubernatorial elections come up, particularly in Georgia.
My one quick last question for you. We've obviously been talking a lot about Georgia's restrictive new voting laws. How is it going to impact the Asian American community and voting access?
Well, we know from a number of Democratic leaders that this is something that will continually impact communities, but specifically communities of color. The provisions that ward against early voting or mailbox dropping off your ballots are something that's really, been concerning to a number of communities. And of course, the provision that limits people from handing out water or snacks in long lines. Communities of color have historically been those that really have a more limited amount of time to actually cast ballots. And so by limiting those timelines and also limiting the comfort in these long lines, it's not only something that will curb access to the ballot, yet a number of people have also said it could have a blowback effect by getting more Democrats and more people of color out to vote early and saying that they want to get the same people who have passed this legislation out of office in this next election.
All right, Maya King, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.